Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the grey zone, the legal no man's land between plant medicine and controlled substance, between folk remedy and federal crime. We're talking about Kratom Analogues, the synthetic and semi-synthetic cousins of a Southeast Asian leaf that the DEA has been trying to ban, regulators have been trying to classify, and ordinary people have been brewing into tea since before the FDA knew it existed. Not the fun, neon-lit drug war. Not cocaine cartels or methamphetamine superheroes. I mean the quiet, spreadsheet and laboratory drug war. The one where a chemist tweaks a single molecule, the government scrambles to update a list and somehow nobody wins. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A genuinely heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and you clearly have a very specific late-night internet history. The fact that people take time to suggest topics like this genuinely shapes what this channel becomes, and I don't take that lightly. If you're on Spotify, we're there too. Links in the description. Go find us. Now, dim those lights, put a fan on, pull a blanket up to your chin, and let's get into it. Because here's what I want you to sit with before we begin. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to exist in a legal grey area? Not breaking the law, but becoming the law? What happens when a plant that's been used for centuries in Malaysian rubber plantations suddenly shows up in American smoke shops under a name like Barley Bliss? Who decides what's a supplement and what's a Schedule I narcotic? Is the line between a plant and a drug just a lawyer and a press release? And what about the people caught in the middle? The chronic pain patients, the opioid survivors, the late-night researchers who just wanted something to take the edge off and now find themselves navigating something that reads like a chemistry textbook crossed with a DEA watch list? Could you tell the difference between a legal herbal supplement and a federally prohibited analogue if someone handed you a capsule? Would you even know what questions to ask? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the early 2000s and someone at a gas station counter in Florida is handing you a small foil packet with a leaf on the label and a price tag of $14. The sign above it says, "All natural." The fine print says, "Not for human consumption." Welcome to the Kratom Analogue era. Nobody told you it would be like this. Let's start at the beginning, which in this case is a tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia, specifically the dense humid jungles of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, where a tree called Mitragina speciosa has been growing, unbothered, for thousands of years. It's a tall tree, unremarkable in appearance, part of the coffee family, and yes, that's a real genealogical fact, not a marketing talking point. For generations, workers in rubber plantations and rice paddies chewed its leaves raw, brewed them into tea, or dried them into a coarse powder. The effects were subtle, a mild stimulant at low doses, a sedative at higher ones, a general softening of the world's harder edges. Nobody called it a drug. Nobody called it dangerous. They called it a work day. The tree itself can grow up to 25 meters tall, with broad, dark green leaves the size of a grown man's hand. It thrives in the kind of heat and humidity that makes you feel like you're being slowly digested by the atmosphere. The soil has to be wet. The sun has to be relentless. It is not a plant that tolerates neglect or temperate climates, which is part of why it never established itself outside its native region until people started drying and shipping it in bulk. Think of it as the anti-house plant. It would not survive your windowsill, it barely survives the journey. What made the leaf useful to plantation workers was precisely what made it unremarkable. It was accessible, it grew everywhere, and it worked quietly. A handful of leaves chewed in the morning made long hours in the heat feel slightly more manageable. A stronger preparation in the evening brought something closer to sedation. At no point was anyone writing a manifesto about it. There were no branding opportunities being explored. A man was tired, a tree was nearby, and the chemistry happened to be compatible. That is the entire origin story, and it is considerably less dramatic than the one that gets told at congressional hearings. In traditional contexts, use was typically moderate and contextual. The way people used kratom in rural Southeast Asia was similar to how people in other parts of the world used coca leaves, cat, or strong tea. Not as a recreational escape, but as a functional tool woven into the rhythms of physical labour. The cultural framework regulated the use as much as anything else did. You chewed leaves before work, not at weddings. You brewed tea for aches, not for entertainment. Nobody was selling it to teenagers outside a concert venue. The plant contains dozens of alkaloids, biologically active compounds that interact with the human nervous system in ways that are still being mapped by researchers who find themselves perpetually underfunded and surrounded by paperwork. The two most significant are mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, which we will get into in considerable detail shortly. But the point here is simpler than chemistry. This is a plant that existed, was used responsibly in its home environment for a very long time, and then got discovered by the global supplement market, which looked at it and saw not a traditional remedy, but an opportunity. And from that moment forward, the story of kratom stops being about a leaf and starts being about everything else. By the time it arrived in the United States, the plant had been stripped of the cultural context that had regulated its use for generations. What remained was the chemistry, the marketing, and a legal framework that had absolutely no idea what to do with either. You're holding something ancient in a world that is very modern, and not in a good way. The tree is still growing somewhere in the rainforest, completely indifferent to all of this. Lucky tree. Here is where it gets interesting, and also where we start to understand why governments get nervous. Kratom doesn't work through magic or tradition, or the placebo effect of brewing something that smells vaguely like a forest floor. It works because of alkaloids, specifically mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, two compounds that interact with the brain's opioid receptors in a way that is, depending on who you ask, either a minor curiosity or an extremely significant red flag. Mitragynine is the dominant alkaloid, making up somewhere between 66 and 100% of the leaf's alkaloid content depending on the harvest and the strain. 7-hydroxymitragynine is present in much smaller quantities, but it's considerably more potent. Some studies have estimated it to be more than 10 times stronger at the mu-opioid receptor than morphine, which is the kind of sentence that tends to end a conversation and start a congressional hearing. Now, the phrase opioid receptor is doing a lot of heavy lifting in public discourse, and it is worth slowing down here. Opioid receptors are not, in themselves, bad. You have them. You were born with them. They are part of the system that regulates pain, mood, digestion, and stress response. Your brain produces its own compounds, endorphins, enkephalins, that bind to these receptors naturally. The problem with opioids as a drug class is not that they interact with these receptors, but that they interact with them far more powerfully and persistently than anything your brain evolved to handle, leading to tolerance, dependence, and at high enough doses, the suppression of the breathing reflex. That last part is how people die. So where does kratom sit on that spectrum? The honest answer is, somewhere in the middle, and the exact location depends on the dose, the product, the individual's metabolism, and whether what they are taking is actually what the label says it is. At low doses, mitragynine appears to behave less like a classical opioid and more like a stimulant, producing alertness and mild euphoria through mechanisms that may involve adrenergic receptors rather than opioid ones. At higher doses, the opioid receptor activity becomes more pronounced. The sedation arrives. the pain relief increases. The profile starts to resemble something closer to a weak opioid, and the risk profile shifts accordingly. 7-hydroxymitragynine complicates everything further. It is structurally related to mitragynine but pharmacologically distinct. A more committed opioid agonist with a higher affinity for the mu receptor and a potency that has alarmed researchers who study it. In the raw leaf, it is present in small enough quantities that its contribution to the overall effect may be modest. In concentrated extracts where the alkaloid profile has been manipulated or enriched, it becomes a much more significant variable. This is the compound that shows up most frequently in discussions of kratom's abuse potential and risk of fatal overdose, and it is the compound that analog chemists have spent the most time studying and modifying. What makes all of this genuinely complicated is that mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine are not simple copies of known opioids. Their molecular structure is unusual enough that researchers believe they may interact with opioid receptors in a structurally distinct way, what pharmacologists call a different binding mode. Some studies have suggested they may be biased agonists, meaning they preferentially activate some downstream signaling pathways over others, which could theoretically mean a different side effect profile than classical opioids. Whether that theoretical difference translates into meaningful clinical benefit, or is simply a talking point in a supplement marketing email, is one of the many questions that the research gap has not yet answered. You're essentially standing in front of a machine you do not fully understand, being told by one group of people that it is probably fine, and by another group that it is definitely dangerous. Both groups are citing the same incomplete data. Welcome to the grey zone. There is a version of Kratom's story that is genuinely ancient and genuinely mundane. A farm worker in rural Thailand chews a few leaves before a long day in the heat, the same way someone might reach for a strong coffee. He has done this for years. His father did it. His grandfather probably did too. Nobody wrote a wellness blog post about it. Nobody made a documentary. There was no logo, no influencer, no suggested serving size. And then, sometime around the 2000s, a version of this leaf began appearing in American head shops and online supplement stores under names like Meng Da, Red Barley, and Green Malay. And suddenly, the ancient met the algorithmic, and everything got considerably more complicated. The traditional use context matters enormously, and it gets almost completely ignored in the modern debate. In Southeast Asian communities where kratom was part of daily life, the preparation was simple: fresh leaves, minimal processing, moderate doses determined by the size of your hand and the depth of your fatigue, not by a milligram scale and a YouTube tutorial. The cultural setting provided implicit guardrails. You did not chew kratom leaves in the morning and then chase them with alcohol. You did not combine them with benzodiazepines. The leaf had a role, and the role had a boundary, and the boundary was understood because it had been passed down through generations of people who had already figured out, through the accumulated experience of a community, what happened when you exceeded it. Strip away that context and you are left with a raw pharmacological agent that the American supplement market wrapped in tropical imagery and sold to people who had no inherited framework for using it safely. The names alone tell the story. Meng Da means something closer to pimp grade in Thai, a slang term for the most potent variety, not a product name intended for a Tuesday afternoon at a health food store in Phoenix. Red barley suggests a specific geographical and harvest origin that is frequently meaningless in commercial products processed and blended on the other side of the world. The branding is the fiction. The chemistry inside the bag is the reality, and those two things are not always as closely related as the packaging implies. Ethnobotanists who have studied traditional kratom use have noted repeatedly that dose escalation and problematic use were relatively uncommon in traditional settings, not because the plant lacked the pharmacological capacity to produce them, but because the cultural context made them socially visible and socially discouraged. If you were chewing too many leaves, people noticed. They said something. There was a community and a practice and a set of norms around it. The American supplement market replaced all of that with a dosage FAQ buried in a vendor's website and a comment section full of strangers arguing about grams. This gap between traditional use and modern consumption is not unique to Kratom. It shows up in every story of a traditional plant medicine being extracted from its origin context, processed into a concentrated commercial form, and marketed to a population with no cultural familiarity with it. The result is almost always the same. The benefits get amplified in the marketing, the risks get amplified in the outcomes, and somewhere in the middle, a regulatory agency starts drafting a notice. You could swap the leaf for a dozen other botanicals and tell the same story. The ancient and the algorithmic are not natural partners. One of them has a terms and conditions page, the other one does not, and that used to mean something. If you wanted to map the moment Kratom entered American culture, you might start somewhere around 2008 or 2009, when it began quietly appearing on the shelves of smoke shops, herbal supplement stores, and, in a development that should perhaps have alarmed someone earlier, gas stations. It arrived packaged in small foil bags or capsule bottles, often with tropical imagery and names that evoked distant jungles without ever quite explaining what was inside. The labelling was creative in that specific way that things are creative when they are trying very hard not to make any medical claims, while also very much trying to suggest that this product might make you feel significantly better than you currently do. The gas station is not an institution associated with nuanced pharmaceutical guidance. It is where you buy coffee in a cup the size of a small bucket and snacks that were manufactured sometime last year. The fact that Kratom found its way onto those shelves, between the energy shots and the novelty lighters, says something important about the regulatory vacuum it was entering. The Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994 had created a framework in which supplements could be sold without pre-market approval from the FDA, as long as no explicit disease claims were made. This was a framework designed for vitamins and herbal teas, not for alkaloid-containing botanicals with opioid receptor activity. But it was the framework that existed, and Kratom walked right through the gap in it. Early American Kratom users were a specific kind of person, internet literate, curious, often already interested in alternative health or harm reduction, and willing to navigate the slightly uncertain experience of ordering a powder from an unfamiliar website and deciding how much of it to put in a glass of orange juice. The community that formed around Kratom in those early years was relatively tight-knit and, by its own standards, careful. Forums shared dosing information. Experienced users cautioned newcomers. There was a collective attempt to preserve some version of the responsible use culture that had existed in Southeast Asia, translated imperfectly but earnestly into the language of Reddit threads and web forums. Then the gas station phase began, and the demographic broadened considerably. Kratom was no longer a product you sought out after reading 40 posts on an ethnobotany forum. It was something you noticed on a spinner rack while paying for your gas, tried on impulse, and either never thought about again or started using weekly. The intentional community around it was diluted by the mass market. Dosing norms that had been painstakingly assembled by long-term users became irrelevant when new users were taking however many capsules came in a package with no reference point for what those capsules contained. The supply chain was, to put it charitably, opaque. Kratom was imported primarily from Indonesia, where the deregulation of its export in the mid-2010s had created a boom industry of processing facilities with wildly variable quality standards. The same powder might be tested and certified by one vendor and sold completely uncharacterized by another. Contamination with heavy metals, microbial pathogens, and, most dangerously sucky, undisclosed active compounds was a real and documented risk. The consumer had no way of knowing which version they were buying, because the label was not required to tell them, and in many cases the vendor did not know either. You're trusting the supply chain of a country you have never visited, processed by a facility you cannot inspect, sold by a website that may or may not still exist next month. The gas station does not know this. The gas station just needed something to put on the spinner rack. The analog problem didn't start with kratom. It started with a basic principle of pharmaceutical chemistry and a legal framework that couldn't quite keep pace with it. If you change a molecule just enough, you may have technically created something new. Not the same compound, not the same drug. Something adjacent. Something that sits right on the edge of the map where the regulations end and the periodic table continues. In the kratom world, this meant chemists and researchers, some academic, some very much not, began synthesizing compounds that mimicked mitragynine structure without being mitragynine itself. They called them analogues. The DEA called them a problem. The chemistry kept going anyway. The first wave of kratom analogues emerged not from criminal enterprises, but largely from academic and pharmaceutical research settings, which is important context. Chemists studying mitragynine structure were doing what chemists do. They made variants of it to understand which parts of the molecule were responsible for which effects. This is standard pharmacology. You want to know if removing a methyl group changes the binding affinity. You want to know if substituting a fluorine atom at a particular position increases or decreases potency. You make the variants, you test them, you publish the results. This work was genuinely scientific, genuinely peer-reviewed, and genuinely never intended to produce recreational drugs. It produced a library of compounds with documented pharmacological activity and publicly available synthesis routes. That library did not stay in the academic journals. The transition from research literature to grey market product is not mysterious. Someone reads a paper, someone else has access to a chemistry laboratory and an interest in revenue. The compound described in the journal, the one that showed 3 times the opioid receptor affinity of mitragynine in a rat model, becomes the active ingredient in a product with a tropical name and a fine print disclaimer. The researchers who published the original paper have no control over this. They published in an academic journal, not a product catalogue. But the internet does not make that distinction, and neither does the market. What made this particularly difficult to address legally was the Federal Analog Act's requirement of intent. To prosecute someone for selling an analog, you generally had to demonstrate that the product was intended for human consumption, which is why the not for human consumption disclaimer became so ubiquitous and so cynically deployed. The substance itself might be pharmacologically identical to a Schedule I compound. The vendor might be well aware that their customers were consuming it. But as long as the label said it was a research chemical or a botanical specimen, the legal case became considerably more complicated. Prosecutors had to prove intent, which required evidence that the vendor knew what they were selling and knew their customers were ingesting it, a burden of proof that many cases could not meet. By the mid-2010s, the kratom analog space had diversified beyond mitragynine variants into territory that was pharmacologically further from kratom and closer to classical synthetic opioids. Compounds originally developed in pharmaceutical research programs and abandoned for various reasons, toxicity concerns, poor bioavailability, regulatory obstacles, were being resurrected and sold under botanical marketing language that described them as enhanced kratom or kratom extract. Some of these compounds had never been tested in humans. Some had been tested and failed for reasons the grey market was not advertising. The distance between the leaf, and what was being sold in its name had grown large enough to drive through. In 1986, the United States Congress passed the Federal Analog Act as part of the Controlled Substances Analog Enforcement Act, which sounds like the kind of legislation that was written in a room full of very alarmed people who had just heard about MDMA for the first time, which is roughly accurate. The Act stated that any substance substantially similar in chemical structure or pharmacological effect to a Schedule I wine or Schedule II drug could itself be treated as a Schedule I substance, but only when intended for human consumption. This was meant to be a catch-all, a dragnet for the loophole seekers, a way to stay one step ahead of the molecule tweakers. In practice, it created new loopholes faster than it closed old ones. The core problem is the word substantially. Substantially similar is a legal standard, not a chemical one, and the gap between those two things is wide enough to build a pharmaceutical company in. What is substantially similar to mitragynine? Is a compound that shares the same indole alkaloid core but has a different substituent at the two positions substantially similar? What about a compound with a similar pharmacological profile achieved through a completely different molecular scaffold? These are not questions that have obvious answers, and in litigation, obvious answers are the only ones that consistently win. Defense attorneys specializing in analog cases have become very good at finding chemists willing to testify that their client's product is not substantially similar to anything scheduled, and prosecutors have become very aware of how hard these cases are to win. The intent requirement compounded the problem. Proving that a substance was intended for human consumption when the label explicitly says otherwise requires circumstantial evidence. The way it was marketed, the context of the sale, the presence of dosing instructions, the nature of the vendor's communications with customers. Some cases have succeeded on this basis. Many have not, particularly when the vendor was careful about their language and operated primarily through websites and packaging that never quite crossed the line into explicit medical or psychoactive claims. The Act was also written in the context of a particular generation of designer drugs, primarily amphetamine analogues and phenethylamines, and its chemical language reflects that context. The indole alkaloid scaffold of mitragynine is structurally distinct enough from the phenethylamine or tryptamine scaffolds that many earlier analogues were based on, that arguments about substantial similarity become genuinely technical and genuinely contested. The law was not written with Kratom Analogues in mind, because Kratom Analogues were not in anyone's mind in 1986. The legislature was thinking about MDMA, not about a Southeast Asian tree's alkaloids and their synthetic derivatives. As a result, you have a 40-year-old law being applied to a problem it was never designed to address, by prosecutors who are not chemists, in front of judges who are not pharmacologists, using standards that experts in the relevant fields actively disagree about. The gavel comes down. The chemistry continues. On August 30th, 2016, the Drug Enforcement Administration published a notice in the Federal Register announcing its intent to temporarily place mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine on Schedule E, effectively making kratom federally illegal overnight. The reaction was immediate, loud, and surprisingly organized. A coalition of kratom users, advocates, and researchers launched a campaign that was, by any reasonable measure, unusual for a drug policy debate. They wrote letters to Congress, submitted formal comments to the DEA, and generated enough political pressure that within weeks, the DA did something it almost never does. It reversed course. It withdrew the notice. It agreed to accept public comment. The leaf had beaten the agency, at least for now. The scale of the response genuinely surprised observers. Over 20,000 public comments were submitted to the DEA during the comment period, a volume more typical of environmental regulatory battles than drug scheduling proceedings. Members of Congress from both parties wrote to the agency expressing concern about the process and the evidence base. Veterans groups, chronic pain patient organisations and harm reduction advocates all weighed in. The argument was not simply, "we like this product." The argument was more nuanced. The evidence used to justify emergency scheduling was inadequate. The process had bypassed the normal public health review, and the populations most likely to be harmed by criminalisation were not the recreational users the agency was concerned about, but the medical patients who had nowhere else to turn. The DEA's original notice cited a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use, the standard Schedule I criteria. Critics pointed out that the evidence base for the first claim was thinner than the agency implied, and that the second claim was somewhat circular, since the research required to establish accepted medical use was itself inhibited by the scheduling status the agency was proposing to create. You cannot generate clinical trial data on a Schedule I substance without extensive DEA licensing, which is deliberately difficult to obtain, which means the absence of clinical trial data cannot itself be used as evidence for scheduling without acknowledging the agency's role in producing that absence. This argument landed. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. The withdrawal was a significant moment in the history of drug policy advocacy, and it was studied carefully by other communities of substance users navigating similar legal threats. It demonstrated that organised, articulate, politically engaged advocacy could influence DEA scheduling decisions in ways that the traditional drug policy debate had rarely seen. The Kratom community had pulled off something remarkable. They had made a federal regulatory agency publicly reconsider a unilateral decision. But the victory was incomplete. The DEA did not permanently abandon its interest in scheduling Kratom. The FDA continued to pursue the issue through different channels. The notice had been withdrawn, not retracted. The temporary placement had not happened, but the agency's position had not fundamentally changed. The leaf was still in the crosshairs. The fight had just moved to a different room. Before we go any further, it is worth pausing to ask a question that gets surprisingly little airtime in policy debates and congressional hearings. Who is actually taking Kratom, and why? Because the image that tends to dominate the conversation, the recreational user, the addict, the person spiralling knee, is only one narrow slice of a much more varied population. Studies and surveys have found that a significant portion of Kratom users are middle-aged adults, often college-educated, often employed, and often using Kratom as a self-managed tool for chronic pain, opioid withdrawal, anxiety or depression. In other words, many of the people reaching for the green powder are reaching away from something considerably more dangerous. Survey data from academic researchers, including work published in journals that specifically study drug use epidemiology, has consistently painted a picture that does not match the media narrative. A 2017 survey of over 8,000 Kratom users found that the average respondent was in their mid-30s to mid-40s, employed full-time, and using Kratom primarily for pain management or to manage withdrawal from opioids or alcohol. Fewer than 10% described their primary motivation as recreational. This is not a portrait of the archetypal drug user as popularly imagined. It is a portrait of a middle-aged person in chronic pain who's either exhausted conventional options, been dismissed by a medical system that ran out of patience for them, or watched what prescription opioids did to people they knew and decided they wanted a different answer. The opioid epidemic context is impossible to separate from the Kratom user profile. The years in which Kratom's American user base expanded most dramatically, roughly 2012 through 2018, were also the years in which the crackdown on prescription opioid prescribing was most aggressive. Physicians who had previously treated chronic pain patients with opioids were being investigated, prosecuted, and threatened with license revocation. Patients who had been maintained on stable opioid regimens for years found their prescriptions suddenly discontinued. Some of those patients turned to heroin and fentanyl. Some turned to kratom. From a harm reduction standpoint, these two outcomes are not equivalent, and treating them identically is not a neutral policy choice. There is also a population of younger users, people in their 20s who found kratom through fitness communities, alternative health spaces, or the general internet, and whose motivations are more varied and whose use patterns are less predictable. This is the population that is most likely to escalate doses, to experiment with concentrated extracts, and to combine kratom with other substances in ways that increase risk. This population gets the most media coverage and is the most visible to emergency room physicians and toxicologists, which creates a systematic distortion in how the overall user population is perceived by the people with the most institutional influence over policy. The person quietly using a moderate kratom dose to manage their fibromyalgia does not end up in a news story. The person who combined a concentrated extract with other substances and had a serious adverse event does. The resulting picture is not false, but it is not the whole picture either. Who uses kratom depends enormously on who is asking and why. The timing of kratom's rise in America is not accidental. The 2000s were the decade in which OxyContin's consequences became impossible to ignore, in which overdose deaths began climbing in ways that looked less like a public health problem and more like a public health catastrophe. And somewhere in the middle of that disaster, some people who had been dependent on prescription opioids or heroin began reporting that kratom had helped them stop. Not officially, not through a clinical trial or a physician recommendation. Just quietly, individually, in online forums and Facebook groups and subreddit threads at 2 a.m, person after person describing the same thing. They had used kratom to step down from opioids, and it had worked for them in ways that nothing else had. The claim is not implausible on pharmacological grounds. If kratom alkaloids interact with opioid receptors at lower efficacy than classical opioids, they could theoretically be used in a similar way to buprenorphine, to occupy the receptor enough to prevent withdrawal while producing a reduced and more manageable opioid effect, and then to taper gradually toward discontinuation. This is, very roughly, the logic of medically supervised opioid substitution therapy applied informally without medical supervision by people who either could not access formal treatment or had decided that formal treatment was not working for them. The obvious concern is that informal substitution with an unregulated, variably dosed botanical product is not the same as monitored buprenorphine therapy, and the differences matter. The researchers who have studied self-reported kratom use for opioid withdrawal have generally found that the reports are credible, that is, the pattern of symptoms described is consistent with what opioid withdrawal and its management would actually look like, but that the outcomes are highly variable and the risks are real. Some people appear to use kratom successfully to manage withdrawal, and then either taper off the kratom itself or maintain on a lower dose long-term with manageable side effects. Others find that kratom dependence simply replaces opioid dependence, and the withdrawal from kratom, while generally described as milder than withdrawal from classical opioids, is still unpleasant enough to create its own maintenance cycle. The exit ramp leads somewhere, but where it leads depends enormously on the individual and the circumstances. What makes this particularly fraught from a policy standpoint is that the people most likely to be using kratom as an opioid exit ramp are also the people most likely to be harmed by kratom's criminalization. If you remove legal access to kratom for someone who's been using it to stay off heroin, you have not removed their opioid use disorder. You have removed one of the tools they were using to manage it, and the remaining options, returning to heroin or fentanyl, entering a treatment system they may have already tried and found inadequate, or going through unmanaged withdrawal, are all worse than the thing you removed. This is the argument that harm reduction advocates make most forcefully, and it is the argument that is most uncomfortable for a prohibitionist framework to address. You cannot simply dismiss it by pointing to kratom's risks without accounting for the risks of the alternative, and in the current fentanyl era, those alternatives are catastrophic. The leaf is not perfect. The leaf is also not the problem. Sometimes those two things have to be held at the same time. The synthesis of mitragynine analogues is not, it should be said, a simple backyard chemistry project. It is serious organic chemistry, involving multi-step synthesis processes, precursor compounds, and a working knowledge of indole alkaloid pharmacology that generally requires either a graduate degree or a very committed self-education. What makes the kratom alkaloid scaffold interesting to chemists and alarming to regulators is how structurally amenable it is to modification. Small changes at specific positions on the molecule can dramatically alter its potency, its duration of action, its receptor binding profile, and crucially, its legal status. This is not a bug in the chemistry. For certain researchers and manufacturers, it is the entire point. The mitragynine scaffold belongs to a class of compounds called monoterpene indole alkaloids, a large and pharmacologically diverse family that includes everything from strychnine to quinine to the anti-cancer drug vincristine. The basic structural framework is well understood by organic chemists, and the literature on its modification is extensive, going back to academic work in the 1960s and 70s that was primarily concerned with understanding the chemistry rather than producing recreational drugs. That literature has since been added to considerably as kratom's rise to prominence attracted serious scientific attention in the 2000s and 10s and generated a body of structure-activity relationship research, studies that systematically map which parts of the molecule do what that is freely available to anyone with internet access and the ability to read a chemistry paper. A medicinal chemist, or someone with equivalent training and intent, can take that published research and use it as a roadmap. You want higher potency at the mu-opioid receptor. The literature tells you which structural modifications have achieved that in prior work. You want longer duration of action? There are papers on that. You want a compound that sits structurally outside the current scheduling language for mitragynine and its known analogues. That requires more creativity, but the published pharmacophore models for the opioid receptor give you a starting framework, and computational chemistry tools that were expensive and specialized a decade ago are now accessible and affordable. The synthesis itself requires equipment, a properly equipped laboratory, precursor chemicals, analytical instruments to confirm the structure of what you have made. These are not trivial requirements, but they are not impossible ones either, and the number of people worldwide who have the necessary skills and access has grown considerably as chemistry education has globalized and laboratory equipment has become cheaper. The compounds that emerge from this process are not identical to kratom alkaloids. They are related, sometimes closely, sometimes distantly, and that relationship is what places them in regulatory crosshairs while also making them legally ambiguous. Some of the synthesized mitragynine analogues that have appeared in grey market products show potency profiles substantially higher than the natural alkaloids. Some show modified receptor selectivity. Some appear to produce respiratory depression at lower doses than mitragynine. Whether any of these properties were deliberately engineered or emerged as side effects of modifications aimed at other targets is often unclear. The arms race, in other words, does not have a coherent strategy on either side. The regulators are trying to schedule compounds as fast as they can identify them. The chemists, or at least the less scrupulous ones, are modifying compounds as fast as they can make them. Neither side is winning. The scoreboard is a list of overdoses. There is a specific art to selling something in a regulatory grey area, and it involves language in ways that would make a copywriter slightly nauseous. Kratom Analogue products have appeared under names that range from the poetically vague Botanical Harmony, Leaf Spirit, Nature's Edge, to the aggressively scientific sounding, featuring references to alkaloid percentages and extraction ratios that imply a precision the testing rarely confirms. The fine print on many of these products historically included the phrase "not for human consumption," a disclaimer that fooled nobody but provided a thin legal buffer. You're selling something. You're labeling it as not for human consumption. The customer is absolutely consuming it. Everyone involved understands this and says nothing. The taxonomy of Kratom product naming reflects the evolution of the regulatory environment around it. Early products use straightforward botanical language, the strain name, the country of origin, sometimes the vein colour of the leaf, which appears to affect the alkaloid profile. This was relatively honest, if incomplete. As regulatory scrutiny increased, the naming conventions migrated toward the more defensively generic. Products with ambiguous names and no explicit connection to Kratom's established identity were harder to target in import alerts and harder to regulate under frameworks developed specifically around the Kratom plant. If your product is called Botanical Alkaloid Blend rather than Redmangda Kratom powder, you've put some distance between yourself and the specific regulatory language. The not for human consumption label deserves its own moment of attention because it is one of the more brazenly hypocritical features of the grey market supplement landscape, and also, in its own way, a kind of masterpiece of regulatory evasion. The label originated as a genuine attempt to keep certain research chemicals and novel psychoactive substances outside of FDA oversight, which covers foods and drugs, but not technically, products not intended for ingestion. The FDA's response has been to argue that actual intended use, not the label's claim, determines regulatory status, and courts have generally agreed. But prosecuting individual vendors for false labeling is resource-intensive, and the disclaimer remains standard practice across the grey market supplement industry, despite its known legal inadequacy. The entire industry is, in a sense, built on a fiction that everyone agrees is a fiction, but which persists because the cost of removing it is currently lower than the cost of what would replace it. Some vendors have moved in the opposite direction, toward more aggressive transparency, third-party testing, and direct customer education, arguing that the long-term survival of the Kratom industry depends on distinguishing legitimate products from grey market junk. These vendors tend to be larger, older, and more financially stable, with enough institutional investment to make regulatory engagement worthwhile. They have pushed for voluntary quality standards, lobbied for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act at the state level, and attempted to build consumer trust through verifiable product information. They are, in a sense, trying to rescue the industry from its own origins. Whether they succeed depends on whether the regulatory environment gives them the space to differentiate themselves before a blanket prohibition eliminates the distinction entirely. The name on the bag in the end tells you everything about where the industry is and nothing about what is inside. Kratom's chemical story does not begin and end with metrogynin and 7-hydroxymetragenine. Even though those two compounds get essentially all of the attention, the leaf contains somewhere between 20 and 40 distinct alkaloids, depending on which analysis you consult, and several of the lesser-known ones have pharmacological activity that researchers are only beginning to understand. Speciosiliatin, for instance, is structurally similar to metragenine, but appears to act as an opioid receptor antagonist rather than an agonist, meaning it may actually blunt some of Kratom's opioid-like effects. Pananthine has mild, smooth muscle relaxant properties. Corinanthidine shows opioid antagonist activity as well. The leaf, in other words, is not a single drug. It is a pharmacological committee, and the committee is contentious. This complexity matters because it challenges the way regulators and researchers typically approach drug scheduling and clinical evaluation, as assessments of a single compound with a defined pharmacological profile. Kratom is not a single compound. It is a mixture, and the proportions of that mixture vary considerably based on the plant's genetics, the soil conditions, the harvest timing, the drying method, and the processing approach. Two products both labelled Kratom can have meaningfully different alkaloid profiles, different ratios of agonists to antagonists, different potencies, and different risk profiles. This is not a quality control problem unique to Kratom. Most botanical medicines face similar variability, but it means that research conducted on one Kratom preparation may not generalize to another, and clinical findings about safety or efficacy based on a specific extract do not automatically apply to the commercial products that patients are actually using. The potential significance of the antagonist alkaloids is underappreciated in public discourse. If speciosiliotine and corinanthidine do meaningfully temper the opioid agonist activity of mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine within the intact leaf, then whole leaf preparations might have a genuinely different safety profile than isolated or enriched alkaloid products, a lower ceiling on opioid receptor activation, a built-in pharmacological break of sorts. This hypothesis has not been rigorously tested in clinical populations. It is based on in vitro receptor binding studies and animal pharmacology. But it is scientifically plausible, and it has important implications for the debate about concentrated extracts and isolated alkaloids. If you remove the minor alkaloids to produce a more potent product, you may be removing the very compounds that made the whole leaf preparation relatively safer than classical opioids. You have optimized the product in a direction that serves the market and undermines the safety. The minor alkaloids also complicate the analog problem. When a chemist synthesizes a mitragynine analog, they are producing a single compound, not a mixture with built-in pharmacological complexity. The resulting product may be more pharmacologically predictable in some ways, which sounds like a benefit until you realize that more predictable in this context means more reliably and completely an opioid, without the potential moderating influence of the antagonist alkaloids present in the leaf. This is one of the ways in which the analog market may be genuinely more dangerous than the natural product it claims to enhance or replace, and it is an argument that has not yet received the attention in policy discussions that the pharmacology would seem to warrant. The committee in the leaf was assembled by evolution over thousands of years. The single compound in the capsule was assembled by a chemist over a weekend. These are not equivalent situations. Here is the fundamental problem with scheduling individual kratom alkaloids, and it is the same problem that has plagued drug policy since the synthetic cannabinoid era of the 2000s and 10s. Chemistry is faster than legislation. By the time a government agency identifies a compound, studies it, drafts an emergency scheduling order, publishes it in the Federal Register, and waits out the comment period, a chemist somewhere has already made 3 structural variants that sit just outside the new rules language. This is not paranoia or exaggeration. It is the documented history of synthetic opioids, synthetic cannabinoids, and designer benzodiazepines, and there is every reason to believe the Kratom analog space will follow the same trajectory. The synthetic cannabinoid story is the most instructive precedent because it followed the same arc most completely. JWH 018, the first widely used synthetic cannabinoid, was identified and scheduled in 2010. Within months, JWH 073 had replaced it on the market. That was scheduled too. Then AB Pinaka appeared, and then AB Fubinaca, and then dozens of variations in a cascading chemical arms race in which each scheduling action generated 3 new compounds. Each new compound in that progression was less well characterized than the one before, and some of them were dramatically more dangerous. Several were associated with mass hospitalization events, seizures, and deaths at doses that the original compounds would not have approached. The scheduling action had not reduced harm. It had displaced harm upward along the potency spectrum while displacing it sideways along the supply chain, away from the visible market and into the completely unregulated one. The Kratom analog space shows signs of following this trajectory, with some important differences. The chemistry is more demanding. Mitragynine analogues are harder to synthesize than most synthetic cannabinoids, and the existing natural product has a large enough user base to make wholesale substitution less commercially attractive than it was in the cannabinoid space. But the structural diversity of possible mitragynine analogues is large enough to sustain a scheduling shuffle for years, and some of the compounds already appearing in grey market products are substantially more potent and more clearly opioid in their pharmacological profile than the natural alkaloids. The pressure toward the higher potency analogue market tends to increase, not decrease, when natural product access becomes restricted or legally uncertain, because the vendors and users who are most sensitive to legal risk are the ones who leave the market, while the ones who remain are precisely those for whom legal risk is not the primary concern. There is also a practical resource constraint on the government side. Emergency scheduling actions require significant analytical and administrative work. The DEA and FDA have finite capacity. When that capacity is being consumed by an expanding list of Kratom analogues, it is not available for other things. The game, from the perspective of the actors who are least interested in public health outcomes, is partly one of attrition. Flood the regulatory pipeline with enough novel compounds that the system cannot keep pace, and the grey market persists in the gaps between the scheduling actions. This is not a strategy that anyone has articulated explicitly in a document that could be cited in a hearing. It is a strategy that the market has discovered empirically, because it works and because the alternative, which is a regulatory framework sophisticated enough to address chemical families rather than individual compounds, does not yet exist. If you wanted to purchase a Kratom analog product in, say, 2019, you did not need to know a guy. You did not need a prescription, a dealer, or even a convincing fake ID. You needed a search engine and a credit card. The online supplement marketplace had become, by that point, a sprawling and largely unpoliced ecosystem of vendors offering everything from raw dried leaf to concentrated liquid extracts to encapsulated alkaloid isolates. All sold openly, all shipped through ordinary postal services, all existing in a legal space that was somewhere between a health food store and a very ambitious regulatory blind spot. The e-commerce infrastructure of the supplement industry is, in a purely logistical sense, extraordinarily efficient. A vendor could be based in any state, source product, from anywhere with an internet connection and a customs form, process orders through standard payment processors, though this began to change as financial institutions grew more cautious about Kratom transactions and shipped domestically without triggering the kind of scrutiny that international packages faced at customs. The ordinary parcel post was not designed to be a drug interdiction system, and it performs poorly in that role. The volume of small packages moving through the domestic postal system is simply too large to meaningfully screen, and unless a specific vendor or shipment had been flagged through investigative work, routine parcels of Kratom-adjacent supplements pass through without issue. Platforms like Amazon initially allowed Kratom products before removing them, citing their policies on controlled substances, a removal that was somewhat complicated by Kratom's actual legal status, which was not, federally, a controlled substance. Third-party e-commerce platforms where independent vendors sold directly to consumers remained active longer. Specialized Kratom vendor websites operated outside any major platform entirely, hosting their own storefronts and processing their own sales. the decentralization of the market made coordinated enforcement difficult. Shutting down one website did not significantly affect the overall supply because the website was not the supply, it was just an interface. The supplier was a warehouse in a different state, which had its own website, and 6 other vendors it also supplied. Social media played a role as well, particularly in the earlier years. Facebook groups dedicated to Kratom use, and vendor recommendations accumulated thousands of members and functioned as informal marketplaces, review aggregators, and harm reduction communities simultaneously. When Facebook began removing Kratom-related groups as part of broader policy enforcement on drug-related content, the community migrated to Reddit, to specialized forums, and to Discord servers. Each migration was disruptive but not terminal. The community was too distributed and too technically literate to be eliminated by platform policy. It simply moved, and it took its information, its vendor reviews, and its collective knowledge with it. The online marketplace for Kratom Analogues is, in this sense, a nearly perfect example of the decentralized resilience that makes internet-era grey markets so difficult for conventional enforcement approaches to address. You cannot arrest a forum, you cannot raid a subreddit. You can only try to keep up, and the internet is considerably faster at reorganizing than the law is at pursuing. The Food and Drug Administration's relationship with Kratom is best described as complicated, contentious, and occasionally bewildering. The agency issued its first import alert on Kratom in 2012, allowing customs officials to detain and refuse entry to Kratom shipments without prior notice. Warning letters followed to specific vendors. In 2018, the FDA published a statement claiming its analysis had found evidence of opioid properties in Kratom and recommending consumers avoid it entirely, a statement that Kratom advocates disputed on both scientific and procedural grounds. The agency had not scheduled the substance, it had not banned it, it had expressed concern in strongly worded press releases, which is a different thing, and the distinction matters. Import alerts are a tool with real teeth in the supplement industry because the majority of commercially sold Kratom is imported from Southeast Asia, primarily Indonesia, and customs interception at the border can significantly disrupt supply chains. The 2012 alert was a significant escalation that affected commercial importers and created uncertainty across the industry. But import alerts are not bans. They shift the burden of proof. Rather than requiring the agency to demonstrate that a product is unsafe before seizing it, an import alert allows seizure without prior notice, and then places the burden on the importer to demonstrate compliance before the product is released. This is an administrative tool, not a criminal one, and it operates through a different mechanism than scheduling or criminal prohibition. For large commercial importers, it was disruptive. For smaller vendors who sourced domestically or through alternative channels, it was largely irrelevant. The 2018 FDA statement deserves scrutiny because of the methodology the agency used to reach its conclusions. Commissioner Scott Gottlieb announced that the FDA had used a computational model, a machine learning tool designed to predict opioid receptor activity from molecular structure, to analyze kratom alkaloids, and had found evidence of opioid binding properties. This was presented as a significant finding and used to support the agency's recommendation against kratom use. Researchers in the field pointed out that the finding was not particularly surprising. The opioid receptor activity of mitragynine was already known from conventional pharmacology and had been published in peer-reviewed literature for years, and that the computational model was not a substitute for the clinical and in vivo evidence that would actually be needed to support a scheduling recommendation. The announcement read, to many observers, more like a political document than a scientific one. The FDA's posture has remained consistently cautious to negative on kratom, without resulting in definitive regulatory action. This creates an awkward position for the agency. It has stated clearly that it considers kratom unsafe and has recommended against its use, but it has not scheduled it, has not banned its interstate sale, and cannot prevent retail sales under the existing supplement regulatory framework without specific evidence of adulteration or unsafe manufacturing. The agency can warn, seize imports, and issue letters. It cannot, under current law, simply remove a botanical supplement from the market because it is pharmacologically active in ways that concern it. This is the constraint the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act created, and kratom is one of the clearest examples of that constraint operating at its most limiting. One of the recurring frustrations in any serious conversation about kratom is the research gap, the enormous space between what people are claiming about the substance and what has actually been studied, replicated and published in peer-reviewed literature. Clinical trials on kratom in human subjects are thin. Most of what is known comes from animal studies, in vitro receptor binding experiments, case reports, and self-report surveys. This isn't because kratom is unworthy of study. It's because studying Schedule I adjacent substances in the United States is, to put it charitably, a bureaucratic obstacle course that has historically discouraged all but the most determined researchers. The regulatory barrier to studying controlled or potentially controlled substances in human populations is substantial. Researchers need DEA schedule, I researcher registration, which requires institutional support and a DEA inspection. They need FDA investigational new drug authorization to conduct clinical trials. They need institutional review board approval, which requires a risk-benefit analysis that is itself complicated by the lack of prior human safety data. And they need funding, which historically has been difficult to secure for substances whose primary current use is recreational or self-medicating, categories that do not attract pharmaceutical industry investment and occupy an ambiguous position in the priorities of government research funders. The result is a catch-22 so perfectly constructed it could serve as a textbook case. The substance cannot be adequately evaluated because the research is too difficult, and the difficulty of the research is partly justified by the lack of adequate evaluation. What exists in the literature is heterogeneous and sometimes contradictory. Animal studies have shown both analgesic efficacy and dose-dependent opioid-like effects, including at high doses respiratory depression. Survey data from human users is largely positive in its self-reported outcomes, but subject to obvious selection bias. The people filling out surveys about kratom use are the ones who are still using it and willing to talk about it, not the ones who had serious adverse events and stopped. Case reports document both benefit, people using kratom to manage chronic pain, opioid withdrawal, anxiety, and harm, overdoses, liver toxicity cases, withdrawal syndromes. The case reports are the most visible in medical literature because hospitals and poison control centres generate them automatically. The benefits are self-reported and not submitted anywhere. This creates a systematic documentation asymmetry in which the harms are formally recorded and the benefits are informally described, and the formal record is what informs regulatory and clinical decision-making. The National Institute on Drug Abuse has funded some kratom research, and a small number of dedicated academic researchers have built careers around the pharmacology of kratom alkaloids with genuine scientific rigour. Their work has substantially advanced the field's understanding of the receptor pharmacology, the structure-activity relationships, and the dependence potential, but the field remains dramatically understudied relative to its public health significance. Millions of people are using kratom in the United States right now. The clinical evidence base to guide safe use, identify contraindications, understand drug interactions, or evaluate therapeutic applications is not commensurate with that scale of use. The people who need the information most are operating with the information least, and the gap between those two things is where most of the harm occurs. It would be incomplete and somewhat dishonest to discuss Kratom analogues without spending time on what the advocates sometimes underemphasize and what the prohibitionists sometimes overstate, the dependence potential. Kratom does produce physical dependence with regular use. Withdrawal from heavy kratom use has been documented and includes symptoms that rhyme unpleasantly with opioid withdrawal: muscle aches, insomnia, irritability, nausea, sweating, and a general sense that the universe has become personally hostile. The severity is debated and appears to vary considerably by dose and duration of use, but it is real. Calling kratom completely harmless because it comes from a leaf is the nutritional label equivalent of calling wine harmless because it comes from grapes. The dependence develops through the same basic mechanism as opioid dependence. Repeated activation of opioid receptors leads to compensatory downregulation of the receptor system, and when the substance is withdrawn, the system is temporarily underactive until it re-equilibrates. The timeline and intensity appear to differ from classical opioid withdrawal in ways that users generally describe as more manageable, not comfortable, but survivable without medical intervention in most cases. Traditional kratom users in Southeast Asia have described withdrawal syndrome from heavy leaf use that is recognized in the medical literature there, and the characterizations are consistent with what Western users self-report. Several days of discomfort, sleep disruption, and craving, followed by gradual resolution. Some cases involving heavy use of concentrated extracts have produced withdrawal syndromes that more closely resemble classical opioid withdrawal in intensity, which suggests the dose and formulation matter considerably. The addiction picture, meaning the compulsive use despite harm, the loss of control, the prioritization of the substance over other life domains, is more complex and more contested. Addiction is not the same as physical dependence. People can be physically dependent on a substance and use it controllably, and cessation successfully. People can be addicted to substances that produce minimal physical dependence. The survey data on kratom suggests that the majority of regular users maintain stable dose levels over time and do not describe the escalating compulsive pattern characteristic of addiction to classical opioids. But a meaningful minority does describe escalating use, difficulty stopping, and interference with daily functioning. That minority is real, it is not trivial, and its existence is relevant to any honest discussion of kratom's risk profile. What makes this particularly complicated in the analog context is that the dependence and addiction potential of novel synthesized mitragynine analogues is essentially unknown. If an analog has higher mu-opioid receptor affinity than mitragynine, it may produce more rapid and more severe dependence. If its pharmacokinetic profile produces a faster onset and shorter duration of effect than the natural alkaloid, it may produce a more reinforcing use pattern. These are exactly the properties that tend to correlate with addiction liability in classical opioids, and there is no clinical evidence on whether the kratom analog market is producing products with these characteristics. The natural product has years of self-reported data and some animal pharmacology to draw on. The analogues have a synthesis paper and a foil bag. The dependence you develop from one may not look anything like the dependence you develop from the other. By the late 2010s, a coalition of kratom advocates and some sympathetic lawmakers had begun pushing for a different approach, not prohibition, not full open market access, but a regulated framework modelled loosely on supplement law. The American Kratom Association championed something called the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, a state-level legislative template that proposed age restrictions on purchase, labelling requirements for alkaloid content, prohibitions on adulterated products, and penalties for vendors who made unverified medical claims. Several states passed versions of the bill. It was, in the scale of drug policy history, a genuinely unusual development. An advocacy group for a grey area substance proposing regulation rather than fighting it. The logic behind the KCPA was straightforward from an advocacy standpoint. If kratom were to survive politically, it needed to demonstrate that it could be regulated responsibly, and the industry needed to be able to point to a regulatory framework that addressed the legitimate public health concerns without resorting to prohibition. Age restrictions acknowledged that kratom was not appropriate for minors and addressed one of the most politically vulnerable aspects of an unregulated market. Labeling requirements for alkaloid content addressed the adulteration and potency variability problems that generated the most compelling safety concerns. Prohibitions on medical claims addressed the FDA's concerns about kratom being marketed as a treatment for opioid addiction or chronic pain without clinical evidence. Taken together, the KCPA represented an attempt to move kratom from the grey zone into something resembling a regulated market, imperfect but governed. The states that passed versions of the KCPA, including Utah, Georgia, Arizona, and others, provided a partial proof of concept. Regulatory frameworks existed. Vendors operating in those states were required to comply with labeling and testing standards, and the political coalition around kratom demonstrated that it was capable of producing affirmative legislative outcomes, not just defensive ones. This was significant because it gave the industry something it had previously lacked: a positive regulatory model to point to when federal discussions arose. Rather than simply opposing federal scheduling, kratom advocates could argue that a workable alternative existed and was already operating in multiple states. The KCPA's limitations are real. It is a state-level framework in a market that operates nationally and internationally, which means its standards apply only within the states that have passed it, and create no binding requirements on vendors based in other states or other countries. It does not address the analog problem at all. A vendor selling a synthesized mitragynine analog rather than natural kratom leaf would not necessarily be covered by KCPA provisions that apply specifically to kratom. And the voluntary quality standards that the American Kratom Association developed alongside the legislative effort rely on vendor participation that the most problematic actors in the market are least likely to provide. But imperfect regulation that exists and is enforced is meaningfully different from no regulation at all, and the KCPA states have demonstrated at minimum that political will exists to try to govern this space. Whether the federal government will reach a similar conclusion remains one of the genuinely open questions in drug policy. If you live in Alabama, kratom is a Schedule I controlled substance. If you drive across the border into Georgia, it is legal and available at the gas station. In Wisconsin, it is illegal. In the state next door, Minnesota, it is legal with no restrictions. This is the American kratom landscape as it has developed. A state-by-state patchwork of contradictory legal statuses that has made interstate commerce confusing, enforcement inconsistent, and the experience of kratom users entirely dependent on the accident of their geography. A chronic pain patient in Indiana who uses kratom to manage their condition is doing something legal. The same person performing the same act after moving to Arkansas is a criminal. The compound did not change. The border did. The patchwork is not the result of a coherent policy logic. It is the result of independent legislative processes in 50 separate states, operating on different timescales, with different levels of interest from law enforcement, different political climates around drug policy, and different degrees of engagement from the kratom industry's advocacy organizations. The states that have banned kratom outright, Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin at various points, with some revisions over time, have generally done so through bills that moved quickly with limited public testimony and limited engagement from researchers or harm reduction advocates. The states that have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act have generally done so after more extensive lobbying efforts, and with some degree of bipartisan support. The remaining states occupy an ambiguous middle ground where kratom is technically legal but unregulated, which is the condition that produces the widest range of product quality and the most unpredictable consumer outcomes. The interstate commerce implications are genuinely strange. Kratom is federally legal in the sense that it is not scheduled at the federal level, which means it can be legally shipped across state lines under federal law, but shipping it into a state where it is controlled under state law may violate the state statutes. The Postal Service does not screen packages for state-specific prohibited substances as a general rule. So kratom products are routinely shipped into states where their possession is illegal, purchased by customers who are breaking their state's law, processed through payment systems that do not filter for state-level substance laws, and delivered by carriers who have no practical way to know what is inside a box labelled herbal supplement. The prohibition in those states is functionally unenforced except in specific cases of targeted investigation. The users in those states are technically criminals. The vendors who ship to them may or may not know or care. The patchwork also creates public health disparities that map onto the same geography as other health disparities. States with stricter drug laws tend to have less robust harm reduction infrastructure generally, which means that kratom users in those states who develop dependence or experience adverse effects are operating in an environment with fewer resources, less clinician familiarity, and more stigma than users in states with more permissive or regulated frameworks. The legal status of the substance does not determine its use. It determines the conditions under which that use occurs, and those conditions are not neutral with respect to outcomes. The map of kratom's legal status is not the map of kratom's public health impact. Those two maps only partially overlap, and the gap between them is where the complicated work of actual harm reduction has to happen. The regulatory vacuum around Kratom Analogues has created a secondary problem that compounds the first one. Without mandatory testing standards, labelling requirements or quality controls, the grey market for these products has become vulnerable to adulteration. Seized kratom products have been found, in documented cases, to contain hydrocodone, fentanyl analogues, and other opioids that were not disclosed on any label. Some of those adulterations were accidental, the result of sloppy manufacturing and facilities producing multiple products. Some were not. When people have died in connection with kratom use, forensic toxicology has frequently found other substances present, a fact that both sides of the policy debate interpret very differently. The contamination pathways are multiple and not always obvious. Shared manufacturing equipment between kratom processing and pharmaceutical or other alkaloid product lines is one vector. A facility that handles poppy-derived alkaloids and kratom may cross-contaminate products through equipment that is not adequately cleaned between runs. Deliberate adulteration by vendors who want to enhance the perceived effect of their product is another. Adding small amounts of a classical opioid to kratom creates a product that feels more potent to users accustomed to pure kratom and may attract repeat purchases at the cost of dosing control and user safety. A third pathway is contamination at the supply chain source. Products entering the supply chain from overseas manufacturers with lower quality standards and minimal testing infrastructure. The fentanyl contamination cases are the most alarming and the most consequential for the mortality debate. Fentanyl is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine, is active at microgram doses, and has essentially no margin for error in non-tolerance users. A kratom user who has developed tolerance to kratom's opioid effects, but no tolerance to classical synthetic opioids, is extremely vulnerable to fentanyl contamination. The kratom dose that they are accustomed to taking safely represents, if fentanyl contaminated, an entirely unknown and potentially lethal dose of the synthetic opioid. Several cases in which kratom was cited as a contributing factor in overdose deaths have, upon closer forensic examination, involved fentanyl or fentanyl analogues as the primary active toxicant. Whether kratom itself would have caused the death is, in these cases, unknowable. Mandatory product testing would not eliminate adulteration, but it would create accountability and traceability that the current system entirely lacks. A product that tests clean at the point of sale and then causes a death attributable to fentanyl contamination at least generates a documented discrepancy that can be investigated. A product with no testing history and no regulatory oversight generates nothing except a death certificate and a disputed toxicology report. The American Kratom Association's GMP program requires third-party testing as a condition of accreditation, and the vendors who participate in that program do provide some consumer protection. But the vendors most likely to contaminate products, deliberately or accidentally, are the least likely to submit to voluntary testing, which means the testing program protects consumers who are already buying from relatively trustworthy vendors. The population most at risk from adulteration is the one least protected by voluntary standards. This is the structural problem that mandatory regulation would address, and that voluntary regulation, however earnest, cannot. If plain kratom leaf powder is at one end of the potency spectrum, the concentrated liquid extracts and standardized isolate products that emerged in the late 2010s are at the other. Products like MIT45, named for a claimed 45% metharagenine content, represent a significant departure from the traditional leaf preparations used in Southeast Asia. Where a traditional kratom tea might deliver a few grams of mixed alkaloids over the course of an afternoon, a single dose of a concentrated liquid extract can deliver metragenine at levels that no traditional preparation would come close to matching. Pharmacologists have noted this distinction with considerable concern. A substance that behaves like a mild stimulant at one dose and a sedative at another does not behave predictably when the dosing is removed from any cultural or traditional context. The concentrated extract market emerged from market pressure, not pharmacological necessity. Kratom leaf powder requires relatively large doses by supplement standards, typically several grams per use, and the taste is, by general consensus, extremely unpleasant. Concentrated extracts allow this same effective dose to be delivered in a much smaller volume, which is more convenient, easier to dose consistently, and easier to sell in a retail environment that rewards compact, elegant packaging over large bags of green powder. The product format that is most commercially attractive is also, not coincidentally, the one that is most prone to creating dependence and the most difficult to dose conservatively. The claimed alkaloid percentages on concentrated kratom products occupy an interesting space between marketing and pharmacology. A product labelled as 45% metragenine is making a specific quantitative claim that requires analytical verification to support, and the degree to which that verification actually happens varies enormously across the market. Third-party testing for alkaloid content is performed by some vendors, with results posted publicly. Other products make similar claims with no publicly available analytical data. The consumer has no reliable way to distinguish between these scenarios from the product label alone, and the variability in actual content between products with similar label claims is large enough to matter clinically. The liver toxicity question is most prominently associated with concentrated extract use. Kratom-associated hepatotoxicity cases, documented instances of liver damage attributed to kratom use, appear disproportionately in users of concentrated products and liquid extracts rather than in users of plain leaf powder. The mechanism is not fully characterized. It may involve direct hepatotoxic effects of the alkaloids at high doses, immune-mediated hepatotoxicity similar to other drug-induced liver injury, or contamination with hepatotoxic compounds in some products. Whatever the mechanism, the concentration of cases around high-dose and extract products suggests that the risk increases with the move away from traditional whole leaf preparations toward the processed, concentrated products that the modern market has optimized for. You've taken the leaf out of the forest, concentrated it into a shot glass, removed the moderating compounds, eliminated the cultural context, and then expressed surprise when the outcomes are different. 7-hydroxymitragynine deserves its own chapter because it is in many ways the compound that most clearly explains why regulators treat kratom differently than, say, valerian root or chamomile tea. It is present in the raw leaf in small quantities, typically less than 2% of the total alkaloid content, but it is a significantly more potent opioid receptor agonist than morphine on a per milligram basis, and it appears disproportionately in concentrated extracts and standardized products. In animal studies, it has produced dose-dependent respiratory depression, the mechanism behind opioid overdose deaths at higher doses. Researchers have synthesized structural analogues of 7-hydroxy specifically to study its pharmacology, and several of those analogues are now appearing in grey market products with no indication of their origins or potency on any label. The pharmacology of 7-hydroxymitragynine is genuinely striking for a compound present in such small quantities in the natural leaf. Early research characterized it as more potent than morphine at the mu-opioid receptor, the receptor most associated with both analgesic efficacy and respiratory depression. And subsequent work has confirmed this potency in multiple model systems. The question of why the natural leaf, with its small percentage of such a potent compound, does not produce more opioid-like effect than it does has been partly answered by the antagonist alkaloid hypothesis discussed earlier, and partly by the relatively low bioavailability of 7-hydroxy from oral leaf preparations. The compound may not be absorbed as efficiently from whole leaf preparations as from the concentrated forms, which would explain why the traditional leaf-chewing practice did not produce the opioid-like toxidrome that the pure compound's pharmacology might suggest. Concentrated and isolated 7-hydroxymitragynine products have appeared on the grey market with increasing frequency as the chemistry has become more widely understood. These products are pharmacologically much closer to classical opioids than anything the kratom plant produces naturally, and their presence in a market that is nominally about a botanical supplement represents a significant escalation of the risk landscape. Someone purchasing a product labelled as a kratom extract that is actually primarily isolated 7-hydroxymitragynine is not consuming a kratom product in any meaningful traditional sense. They're consuming a synthetic opioid of moderate potency with an unusual molecular structure, and they may have no idea of this distinction. The 7-hydroxy story also illustrates the tension between academic research and regulatory outcomes. The compound's potency and opioid properties were identified and published by legitimate researchers studying kratom's pharmacology with the intent of understanding it better. That published work then provided a roadmap for grey market producers interested in isolating and concentrating the compound for sale. The researchers cannot be blamed for this. Scientific knowledge is published to advance human understanding, not to serve as a product development manual for unregulated supplement companies. But the outcome is a recurring feature of the drug landscape. Academic chemistry papers become industrial synthesis protocols through a transformation process that takes months and requires nothing more than a motivated reader and access to laboratory equipment. The science advances, the market follows, the regulators arrive last. Thailand banned kratom in 1943, not primarily because of drug concerns, but because the government realized that people were using it instead of paying taxes on opium. The leaf was cheaper, more available, and required no international supply chain. This is, depending on your perspective, either a completely cynical act of revenue protection disguised as public health policy, or a remarkably straightforward admission that drug laws are sometimes about money. Thailand reversed its ban in 2021, reclassifying kratom as a medicinal plant and permitting its use. Malaysia maintained its restrictions. Australia requires a prescription. The European Union has no unified position, leaving member states to legislate individually. The plant existed for thousands of years before any of these governments decided to have an opinion about it, and several of those opinions directly contradict each other. Thailand's reversal is the most instructive case study because it reflects the kind of policy evolution that is theoretically possible but rarely achieved in practice. After nearly 80 years of prohibition, the Thai government undertook a reassessment that acknowledged the traditional cultural status of the plant, noted the lack of compelling evidence that its criminalization had reduced harm relative to more dangerous substances, and recognized the potential economic value of a legal kratom industry in a country where the plant grows naturally and where the expertise for its cultivation and processing already exists. The reversal was not without conditions. Sales to minors were restricted, medical claims were regulated, and a licensing framework for commercial production was established. But the fundamental shift was toward treating kratom as a medicinal and traditional plant rather than a controlled substance, and the sky did not fall. Malaysia's continued restriction reflects a different political calculation, one in which the association of kratom with substance dependence in traditional use communities is weighted more heavily than its potential therapeutic applications or its cultural history. Malaysian courts have dealt with kratom-related cases for decades, and the legal framework treats kratom more like a controlled substance than a supplement. The contrast between Thailand and Malaysia is useful precisely because the plant and the population are broadly similar. The same tradition, the same cultural context, the same botanical source. The different legal outcomes reflect different political and public health judgments about the same evidence base. There is no objective policy answer that falls out of the pharmacology. There are choices made by governments about how to balance competing values. Australia's prescription requirement represents yet another model, neither prohibition nor open market, but a framework that restricts access to the medical channel and requires physician oversight. This approach theoretically allows therapeutic use for legitimate patients, while discouraging recreational use and ensuring some level of clinical monitoring. In practice, the number of Australian physicians willing to prescribe kratom is very small. The regulatory burden of doing so is significant, and the result is that most Australian kratom users either obtain it illegally or do without. A framework that exists on paper without accessible implementation is functionally closer to prohibition than to regulation. The international landscape does not offer a clean model to follow. It offers a set of experiments whose results are inconsistent, whose methodologies are incomparable, and whose lessons are disputed. What it does confirm, unambiguously, is that there is no international consensus on what kratom is or how it should be governed, which means every country and every state within a federalized system is making it up as it goes. In the absence of robust clinical literature, much of what practitioners, including harm reduction workers and physicians, know about how people actually use kratom comes from an unlikely source: online forums. Subreddits dedicated to kratom use, recovery and harm reduction contain thousands of posts documenting dosing strategies, strain comparisons, withdrawal experiences, and interactions with other substances, all submitted voluntarily by users who are, in many cases, more scrupulously honest about their experiences than the regulatory system is about its own limitations. This self-reported data is imperfect, self-selected, and unverifiable. It is also, in some domains, the most detailed information available. The forum culture around Kratom has its own norms, hierarchies, and contradictions. Long-term users with extensive personal experience often serve as informal advisors to newer members, sharing dosage guidance, strain recommendations, and warnings about specific products or vendors. The community collectively maintains a body of knowledge about what seems to work, what seems dangerous, and what seems to represent marketing fiction, assembled through thousands of individual experiments and reported outcomes over years. This is not science in the formal sense. It is also not nothing. In the absence of clinical trials, the aggregated experience of a large, motivated, and self-documenting community is a meaningful signal, even if it cannot substitute for controlled research. Epidemiologists have a term for this kind of data, syndromic surveillance, and while it is not the gold standard for anything, it has historically identified signals that formal surveillance systems missed entirely, precisely because the people living the experience are watching it more closely than any institution is. The harm reduction norms that developed in early Kratom forums were relatively conservative by the standards of the broader supplement market. Experienced community members warned against daily use, against dose escalation, against combining Kratom with other sedatives or opioids, and against the use of concentrated extracts, positions that predate much of the clinical literature supporting those concerns, and that emerged from the community's own accumulated experience of what led to problems. These norms were imperfect and inconsistently enforced. New users arrived in waves, each wave less likely than the last to have read the pinned posts at the top of the forum. The norms degraded over time as the community grew and the culture diluted. But in the early years of the American Kratom market, the forum communities were genuinely the primary source of safety information for most users, better than anything available from vendors, physicians, or regulators, which is a more damning commentary on those institutions than it is a compliment to Reddit. The vendor review function of these forums is particularly significant from a market accountability standpoint. User reviews of Kratom vendors, with detailed assessments of product quality, batch consistency, potency, packaging, and customer service, created a reputational mechanism in the absence of any regulatory accountability. Vendors with consistently positive reviews attracted business from a community that talked about products in granular, specific terms, users describing the smell, color, grind consistency, and effect profile of specific batches in language that would not be out of place in a pharmaceutical quality review. Vendors with reports of underdosed capsules, mislabeled strains, suspected adulteration, or poor customer service were publicly called out in threads that ranked highly in search results and persisted over time. The reputational consequence of a bad batch, documented in a forum thread, was measurable in vendor revenues. This is market discipline operating through radical transparency, and while it is categorically not a substitute for laboratory testing and regulatory oversight, it has filtered out some genuinely dangerous actors over time. The self-reported data from these forums has also attracted serious academic attention. Researchers at institutions including the University of Rochester, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia have used structured surveys deployed through Kratom forums and social media communities to collect epidemiological data about Kratom users, demographics, use patterns, motivations, outcomes, and adverse events. The results of these surveys, published in peer-reviewed journals, have provided some of the most detailed information available about who uses kratom and why, precisely because the forum communities were accessible, cooperative, and willing to participate in research that might influence the regulatory environment they were navigating. This is a genuinely unusual relationship between a research subject community and the academic institution studying it, characterized by mutual interest and mutual suspicion in roughly equal measure and productive despite both. The limitations of forum data deserve acknowledgement alongside its contributions. The forum population is not representative of all kratom users. It skews toward people who are more educated, more internet engaged, and more motivated to document and discuss their use than the average gas station kratom buyer. The self-selection bias means that the forum overrepresents people with strong opinions about kratom, both positive and negative, and may underrepresent the large middle ground of casual, moderate users who have no particular investment in the policy debate. Adverse events that occur in forum-disengaged users, the people who bought something once and had a bad experience and never looked at another kratom website again, are systematically invisible to forum-based surveillance. The picture that emerges from the forum data is real and meaningful, but it has edges, and the edges matter for policy. What the forums represent in the end is a community doing its best to govern itself in the absence of external governance, creating norms, enforcing standards, generating data, and protecting its members through collective attention in a space where no institution was paying that attention. It is an improvised response to an institutional failure, and like most improvised responses, it is impressive precisely because it worked at all, and limited precisely because improvisation has inherent ceilings. The forums cannot test products, they cannot enforce labeling standards, they cannot mandate vendor accountability, they can only watch, report, and warn, and hope that the people who need the warning are reading. One of the quieter complications of the kratom grey market is what it does to the patient-physician relationship, specifically what it encourages patients not to say. Because kratom occupies such an ambiguous legal and social space, many patients who use it choose not to disclose that use to their doctors, either out of concern about judgment, fear of being labelled a drug seeker, or simple uncertainty about whether it is relevant. This matters clinically because kratom alkaloids interact with the cytochrome 450 enzyme system in ways that can affect how the liver metabolizes other medications, including anticoagulants, certain antidepressants, and some cardiovascular drugs. A patient who does not disclose kratom use is a patient whose physician may be working with an incomplete picture of their pharmacology, and in medicine, incomplete pictures have consequences. The cytochrome 450 interaction is not theoretical and not trivial. Mitragynine is a known inhibitor of CYP3A4 and CYP2D6, two of the most clinically significant enzymes in hepatic drug metabolism. CYP3A4 is responsible for metabolizing roughly 50% of all clinically used medications. CYP2D6 handles a large proportion of psychiatric medications, including many antidepressants, antipsychotics, and opioid pain relievers. When these enzymes are inhibited, that is, when their activity is reduced by the presence of a competing substrate, the drugs they normally metabolize accumulate to higher plasma concentrations than anticipated. For medications with wide therapeutic windows, this may produce no clinically significant effect. For medications with narrow therapeutic windows, certain antiarrhythmics, immunosuppressants, anticoagulants like warfarin, and some antidepressants, the difference between an expected concentration and an elevated one can be the difference between therapeutic and toxic. A patient who is stable on warfarin and begins using kratom daily may find their anticoagulation control drifting upward without any change in their warfarin dose, because the kratom is inhibiting the enzyme that metabolizes warfarin, allowing it to accumulate. A physician monitoring that patient's INR, observing unexpected elevations, and adjusting the warfarin dose downward to compensate is solving the wrong problem. They are titrating around an interaction they do not know exists. If the patient then stops using kratom voluntarily, or because their supply runs out, or because they are hospitalized for an unrelated reason, the enzyme inhibition resolves, the warfarin metabolism normalizes, and the now lowered dose becomes insufficient. The patient is subtherapeutic. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is a documented category of drug interaction that occurs with multiple cytochrome 450 inhibitors, and kratom is one of them. Physicians, for their part, are not uniformly positioned to receive disclosure about kratom constructively even when patients attempt it. Many physicians have limited formal familiarity with kratom. It was not a significant part of clinical training curricula until recently, and even current graduates may have received only brief exposure to it in pharmacology courses that prioritize more common substances. The information that does circulate in clinical settings about kratom is often dominated by the FDA's communications and by case reports of serious adverse events, which creates a baseline impression of the substance as primarily dangerous, rather than as a complex botanical with a variable risk depending on preparation, dose, and individual context. A patient who discloses kratom use to a physician operating from this baseline may encounter an immediate and unqualified recommendation to stop, framed in terms that signal judgment rather than clinical engagement. When that happens, when a patient feels judged, dismissed, or lectured rather than heard, several things follow. The patient may stop disclosing kratom use to that physician and to subsequent ones. They may disengage from the clinical relationship more broadly. They may feel that the medical system is not a safe space for honest disclosure about their choices, a feeling that is then generalized to other substances and other health behaviors that would benefit from clinical attention. The long-term cost of a single judgmental interaction about kratom is not only the missed interaction data for that one medication, it is deterioration in the patient's trust in the medical encounter as a space for honesty, which affects every health conversation they have going forward. This is why harm reduction training explicitly addresses the language and framing of substance use inquiries, not because clinicians should be without clinical concern about risky substances, but because the manner in which concern is expressed determines whether it is received as useful information or as a reason to stay silent. The disclosure problem is also a structural one that goes beyond individual physician-patient dynamics. Standard medical intake forms and electronic health record templates in most clinical settings do not include kratom as a named substance and substance use history sections, which means patients are not prompted to report it, and clinicians are not cued to ask about it. The category herbal supplements appears on most intake forms, but patients do not always classify kratom as an herbal supplement. Some consider it a drug, some consider it a medication, some consider it neither, and the ambiguity of the category means that kratom use is systematically underreported in clinical records, even among patients who would not deliberately conceal it. Updating clinical intake infrastructure to specifically include kratom sets, alongside other commonly used botanicals with significant pharmacological activity, is a relatively low-cost intervention that would meaningfully improve clinical data quality. It has not yet become standard practice, which tells you something about the pace at which clinical systems adapt to grey market realities. The population most affected by the physician problem is also the population least likely to encounter clinicians who have kept pace with the kratom literature. Primary care physicians in rural and lower income areas, where both chronic pain rates and kratom use rates are higher, are more likely to have limited time, limited access to continuing medical education on novel substances, and patient panels with complex comorbidities that make polypharmacy interactions particularly consequential. The patients with the most to gain from good clinical communication about kratom are the ones most likely to be having that conversation with a physician who has never heard a lecture on mitragynine pharmacology. This is not a criticism of those physicians. It is a description of a system that has not yet invested in equipping them for the reality their patients are living. There is a school of thought in public health, not a fringe school, but a well-established one with decades of evidence behind it, that says the most effective drug policy is not the one that achieves the most dramatic-sounding prohibition, but the one that reduces the most actual harm to actual people. Applied to Kratom Analogues, this argument looks something like this. People are using these substances regardless of their legal status, regardless of warning letters, regardless of DEA scheduling announcements, and regardless of concerned op-eds in medical journals. Given that this is the reality, the question becomes not how to stop the use, but how to make it less likely to kill someone, through testing standards, potency labeling, adulterant screening, and access to evidence-based information. Harm reduction as a philosophy is uncomfortable for a prohibitionist framework because it requires accepting an empirical fact that prohibition is ideologically motivated to deny, that drug use will continue irrespective of legal consequences, and that the policy question is therefore not whether people will use substances, but under what conditions they will do so. The history of public health interventions built on this premise is consistent and compelling. Needle exchange programs do not increase intravenous drug use. The evidence for this is now so robust that the debate has effectively ended in most clinical settings, even as it continues in some political ones. They reduce HIV and hepatitis C transmission among people who are already using intravenous drugs, which is the population that needed the intervention. Naloxone distribution does not increase opioid use. It prevents opioid overdose deaths among people who are already using opioids, which is the outcome that mattered. Safe consumption sites do not attract new drug users. They provide a supervised environment in which existing drug users are less likely to die alone of an overdose, which is the harm they were designed to address. In each case, the prohibitionist prediction was wrong. In each case, the harm reduction intervention worked in the way it was designed to. Applied specifically to kratom analogues, harm reduction looks like a set of concrete, implementable interventions whose effectiveness can be evaluated. Mandatory product testing and accurate potency labeling at the point of manufacture would allow users to make dosing decisions with real information rather than the label fiction that currently passes for product specification. A user who knows their product contains 42 milligrams of mitragynine per dose has been tested negative for heavy metals and fentanyl contamination and was manufactured under conditions that meet basic good manufacturing practice. Standards is in a categorically different position from a user who is working from a foil packet with a tropical leaf logo and the phrase premium blend. These two people are both making choices about substance use. One of them has information, the other is guessing. Harm reduction gives them the information. Fentanyl test strips deserve specific mention because their relevance to kratom adulteration is not widely understood outside harm reduction communities. These are inexpensive, commercially available test strips that detect the presence of fentanyl at very low concentrations in a dissolved sample of any substance. They were originally developed for harm reduction in the heroin and methamphetamine user populations, where fentanyl adulteration has driven a massive increase in overdose deaths. The same chemistry that makes them effective for heroin makes them effective for kratom products. You dissolve a small amount of the product in water, dip the strip, and read the result in 2 minutes. If Kratom products are being adulterated with fentanyl at the rate that some case reports suggest, fentanyl test strips in the hands of Kratom users represent a straightforward and low-cost intervention to prevent some of those deaths. Distribution of these strips through harm reduction organizations, smoke shops, and Kratom vendors is not a complicated logistical problem. It is a political one, because in many jurisdictions, fentanyl test strips were until recently classified as drug paraphernalia, and their distribution was itself illegal, a policy position that is difficult to justify on any public health grounds, and that has been reversed in a number of states in recent years, too slowly. Clear, non-judgmental educational information about the specific risks of concentrated extracts versus whole leaf preparations, about drug interactions with commonly prescribed medications, about the signs of dependence and how to taper safely, and about what to do in the event of a suspected overdose. This is the informational infrastructure of harm reduction, and it is largely absent from the Kratom market. The vendor websites that do provide this information are a minority. The regulatory agencies that could mandate its provision have instead focused their communication energy on recommending against Kratom use entirely, which is the communication equivalent of telling a driver not to drive rather than teaching them to wear a seatbelt. One of these approaches prevents accidents, the other prevents the acknowledgement that accidents happen. Treatment access for Kratom dependence requires specific mention because the clinical infrastructure for it is not well developed. A patient presenting to an addiction medicine specialist for help, tapering from heavy Kratom use may encounter a clinician who has managed classical opioid use disorder many times but has little specific experience with Kratom dependence. Its typical timeline, its characteristic symptom pattern, the agents that have been used off-label to manage it, and the dosing strategies that users themselves have found effective. The harm reduction approach to this gap is to actively compile and disseminate the clinical knowledge that does exist, to create formal clinical guidance based on the best available evidence, even where that evidence is imperfect, and to ensure that treatment is available and accessible to people who seek it, without requiring that they have hit a particular rock bottom before they qualify. Dependence that is treated early is easier to treat than dependence that is treated late, and a system that requires severity as a condition of access is optimizing in the wrong direction. The Kratom vendor landscape spans an enormous range, from small family-owned businesses that have been operating for over a decade, testing their products and building communities of loyal customers, to pop-up operations of unknown origin, selling unnamed powders in unlabeled bags out of temporary online storefronts that disappear when the first regulatory notice arrives. The American Kratom Association developed a good manufacturing practice program intended to create a voluntary accreditation system for reputable vendors, complete with third-party lab testing requirements. The challenge, as always in voluntary systems, is that the vendors most in need of oversight are the least likely to seek accreditation. The reputable ones line up. The dangerous ones opt out. The economics of the Kratom market have been shaped by the same regulatory uncertainty that shapes everything else in this story, and the dynamics that result are not favourable to quality. A vendor investing in laboratory testing, supply chain verification, staff training, compliant labelling, and documentation of manufacturing practices is absorbing real and substantial costs that a vendor who does none of those things does not bear. In an unregulated market where the consumer cannot easily distinguish the compliant vendor from the non-compliant one, because there is no label requirement that signals compliance, no government certification that verifies it, and no enforcement action that removes non-compliant products from shelves, the cost of compliance is a competitive disadvantage. This is the classic market failure of information asymmetry. The buyer cannot assess product quality at the point of purchase, so price becomes the primary signal, and quality cannot command a reliable premium. Vendors who invest in quality have thinner margins than vendors who do not, and over time the market pressure works against investment in safety. Mandatory baseline standards would convert the compliance cost from a competitive disadvantage into a fixed cost of market entry, leveling the field in a way that rewards investment in quality rather than penalizing it. The diversity of the vendor landscape also reflects the diversity of the supply chain that feeds it. Commercial kratom is sourced primarily from Indonesia, where the emergence of a large-scale export industry in the mid-2010s created hundreds of processing operations with wildly variable capabilities. Some Indonesian kratom processors operate sophisticated facilities with in-house analytical chemistry, microbial testing, and traceability documentation. Others operate small-scale drying and grinding operations with no testing capacity and minimal quality infrastructure. American vendors sourcing from the former are receiving a categorically different product from vendors sourcing from the latter, but both products arrive in unlabeled export bags and become indistinguishable once they enter the distribution chain. An American vendor who purchases product from a reputable Indonesian processor and one who purchases from an unknown source may both describe their product as Indonesian kratom with equal legal accuracy. The consumer has no way of knowing which they are buying. The gas station tier of the market represents the most problematic end of the vendor spectrum from a consumer protection standpoint, and it is also the hardest to reach through voluntary industry standards. The convenience store or gas station that stocks kratom products typically sources them from a regional distributor, who may in turn source from any number of wholesale suppliers, none of whom have a direct relationship with the retailer, and none of whom are accountable to that retailer's customers. The retail employee who rings up a kratom purchase knows nothing about the product, and cannot be expected to. The retailer does not have the margin, the expertise, or the regulatory incentive to conduct product vetting. The distributor is handling dozens of products and applying no systematic quality standard to any of them. The result is a supply chain in which accountability is distributed so thinly across so many parties that it effectively does not exist, and the consumer at the end of the chain has no recourse when something goes wrong except to not buy it again, which is cold comfort if what went wrong was serious. The more sophisticated vendors, those with established online presences, dedicated customer bases, visible third-party testing programs, and meaningful investment in customer education, represent a meaningfully different risk environment for their customers. The best of these operations publish batch-specific certificates of analysis showing alkaloid content, heavy metal levels, microbial contamination counts, and residual solvent data. They maintain documented relationships with specific Indonesian suppliers whose farms and processing facilities they have visited. They test incoming product before packaging it. They have policies against selling to customers whose purchase patterns suggest escalating dependence. They provide dosing information and interaction warnings on their websites. They engage with harm reduction organizations and kratom advocacy groups. They are, in short, operating as a regulated industry would operate, not because they are required to, but because they have calculated that their long-term business survival depends on differentiating themselves from the race to the bottom end of the market. What this tier of vendors knows about the products they sell is substantial. In some cases, more than the clinicians treating their customers, the accumulated expertise in kratom alkaloid chemistry, strain variation, harvest timing effects, and product formulation that exist within the established vendor community represents a genuine knowledge asset that has never been systematically engaged by the regulatory or clinical establishments that could most benefit from it. There are vendors who know more about the practical pharmacology of mitragynine than most physicians who will ever treat a kratom-dependent patient. That expertise exists entirely outside formal institutional channels, is not published in any peer-reviewed journal, and is applied daily to decisions that affect consumer safety. It is one of the odder features of the Kratom landscape, a grey market industry with a higher practical expertise concentration in some segments than the institutions nominally responsible for overseeing it. The mortality data around Kratom is contested in ways that make it genuinely difficult to know what to conclude. The FDA has pointed to dozens of deaths in which Kratom was identified as a contributing factor. Kratom advocates have consistently pushed back, arguing that in the vast majority of those cases, multiple substances were present, often including fentanyl, benzodiazepines, or other opioids, and that attributing causation to Kratom alone is scientifically unjustified. Both positions contain some truth. Multi-drug toxicity is real, and disentangling individual contributions in a polydrug overdose is genuinely hard. But the frequency with which Kratom appears in toxicology reports alongside fentanyl also raises questions about the adulteration problem that neither side has fully answered, and the gap between those two observations is where most of the policy debate currently lives. The attribution problem in overdose toxicology is methodologically significant and not widely understood outside forensic pathology circles. When a medical examiner determines cause of death in a fatal overdose involving multiple substances, the determination involves judgment about which substances were present at pharmacologically significant concentrations, which effects were additive or synergistic, and which substance or combination of substances most plausibly caused the physiological failure that resulted in death. This judgment is made with the information available at the time, typically a quantitative toxicology screen, a clinical history that may be incomplete, and whatever physical findings are present at autopsy. It is not made with the precision of a controlled pharmacology experiment. The standard contributed to death finding does not represent a causal determination in the scientific sense. It represents a clinical judgment under uncertainty about a pharmacologically complex event with incomplete data. This matters for the Kratom mortality debate because the FDA's case series, the collection of deaths the agency cited as evidence of Kratom's danger, was not a systematic epidemiological study. It was a compilation of adverse event reports submitted voluntarily to the agency's reporting systems and of cases identified through FDA-initiated investigations. These systems are known to capture a non-representative sample of adverse events. They are more likely to receive reports when the substance involved is under regulatory scrutiny, when clinicians and family members are aware of the substance's name and motivated to report, and when the event was dramatic enough to trigger investigation. The number of deaths attributed to Kratom in the FDA's case series does not represent the total number of Kratom-attributable deaths, which the agency cannot know. It represents the deaths the agency was aware of, which is a different and systematically smaller and more dramatic sample. The cases in the FDA series that generated the most attention involved individuals with documented polysubstance use, in whom Kratom was identified as present alongside one or more classical opioids, benzodiazepines, or other CNS depressants. The pharmacological plausibility of Kratom as the primary cause of death in these cases is generally lower than the plausibility of the other substances, which have better characterized dose-response relationships for respiratory depression. But lower plausibility is not the same as impossible, and Kratom's potential contribution, through additive or synergistic effects on opioid receptor-mediated respiratory depression, cannot be excluded in cases where it was present at significant concentrations alongside other depressants. The honest answer in most of these cases is that we do not know, and cannot know with the data available, whether Kratom was necessary for the death to occur. We know it was present. We know the person died. The causal chain in between is genuinely uncertain. The news coverage dimension of the mortality debate deserves its own scrutiny, because media coverage is the primary mechanism through which public and political opinion about kratom's risk is formed, and that coverage is structurally biased in ways that are important to understand. News about kratom deaths follows the standard template of substance-related risk journalism. A specific, named individual with a family, a before and after narrative, a product identified as the cause, and a call for regulatory action. This template is emotionally resonant, politically actionable, and deeply misleading as a guide to epidemiological reality. The person who died after taking a severely adulterated kratom product, alongside a benzodiazepine and an opioid, is a real person whose death is a real tragedy. But they are not representative of the experience of the millions of people who use kratom without acute harm, and coverage that presents their death as the paradigm case of kratom use is systematically overstating the risk to the typical user. The counterfactual also matters and is almost never discussed in news coverage. For a meaningful portion of the people who have died in circumstances where kratom was present in the toxicology, the counterfactual world in which they were not using kratom is not a world in which they were using nothing. It is a world in which they were using classical opioids, possibly heroin or fentanyl, to manage the same condition that kratom was addressing. In that counterfactual world, the risk of accidental fatal overdose is substantially higher than in a world of kratom use. A mortality analysis that counts kratom-associated deaths without accounting for this substitution effect is not measuring kratom's harm relative to the realistic alternative. It is measuring kratom's harm relative to an idealized counterfactual of abstinence that does not reflect the actual behavior of the population in question. This is not an argument that kratom is harmless. It is an argument that the numbers as usually presented do not mean what they are presented as meaning. Here is the darkest room in the house. As analytical chemistry has advanced, so has the speed of analog synthesis. Artificial intelligence tools that can predict receptor binding affinities from molecular structure are now being used by academic researchers studying pain pharmacology. They are also, almost certainly, being used by people with less academic intentions. The ability to computationally design novel opioid receptor agonists that sit outside existing scheduling language, synthesize them in small quantities, and test their effects before any regulatory body knows they exist, represents a genuine escalation in the cat-and-mouse dynamic, one for which the current regulatory framework, which moves at the pace of Federal Register publication cycles and congressional scheduling hearings, may not be adequate. Generative AI applied to molecular design is not speculative technology. It is an active and rapidly advancing area of pharmaceutical research, with commercial applications in drug discovery pipelines at major pharmaceutical companies and academic programs worldwide. Models trained on large databases of known drug receptor interactions can generate candidate molecules with predicted activity profiles in hours, narrowing the search space for researchers looking for compounds with specific binding properties. The same fundamental capability that helps a pharmaceutical research team identify a novel analgesic lead candidate, a compound that might help patients with chronic pain without the addictive potential of classical opioids, can, in principle, help a different kind of operator achieve a different goal. A novel grey market psychoactive with opioid receptor activity that does not match any existing scheduled compound, and that exists nowhere in the regulatory literature. The tool does not know the difference between these applications. It generates candidates. The application is determined by the user. The synthesis barrier that has historically moderated the speed of this race remains real and should not be minimized. Computational design identifies candidate structures, but transforming a candidate structure into a physical sample requires organic chemistry with actual reagents and equipment, and the difficulty of that synthesis varies enormously depending on the target molecule's structural complexity. For compounds close to known mitragynine analogues, with established synthesis routes in the published literature, the barrier is moderate, meaningful but not prohibitive for someone with graduate-level chemistry training and access to appropriate equipment. For compounds with genuinely novel structural features that require innovative synthesis, the barrier is substantially higher. The synthesis barrier has been the primary moderating factor in the designer drug space for the past 2 decades, and it has slowed the escalation without stopping it. As AI-assisted retrosynthesis tools improve, tools that identify optimal synthesis routes to novel target molecules, the barrier will lower further. The regulatory response to the escalating pace of analog emergence has been consistently reactive. The DEA's Emergency Scheduling Authority allows it to temporarily schedule a substance for 2 years, with possible extension, while the formal scheduling review is completed. This is faster than the ordinary rulemaking process, but it still requires the agency to become aware of a compound, gather sufficient evidence of its pharmacological properties and abuse potential, draft and publish a notice, and wait out the response period. In the synthetic cannabinoid proliferation that peaked in the early to mid-2010s, new compounds were appearing in the grey market faster than the emergency scheduling process could address them. The DEA responded by scheduling entire chemical families, all JWH series cannabinoids, all synthetic cannabinoids meeting a broad structural description, rather than individual compounds. This family scheduling approach is constitutionally and legally more complicated than compound-specific scheduling, but is the only mechanism that comes close to keeping pace with a market that is generating structural variants faster than individual scheduling actions can address. For Kratom Analogues specifically, family scheduling faces the additional challenge that the mitragynine scaffold is embedded in a larger chemical family, monoterpene indole alkaloids, that includes pharmacologically diverse and medically useful compounds. Scheduling all monoterpene indole alkaloids to address the analog problem would potentially encompass compounds with legitimate medical applications that have nothing to do with opioid receptor activation. The boundaries of a family scheduling approach would need to be defined with sufficient chemical specificity to capture the relevant analogues without sweeping in unrelated compounds, which requires exactly the kind of sophisticated chemical taxonomy that most legislative drafting processes are not equipped to produce. This is a genuinely hard problem, and it does not have an obvious solution within the current legislative and regulatory architecture. The broader picture of what happens when computational chemistry and grey market manufacturing continue to develop in parallel, with a regulatory framework that has not fundamentally modernised since 1986, is one that drug policy researchers treat with genuine alarm. The Kratom analog problem is not yet at the scale of the synthetic opioid crisis. It is smaller, slower developing, and centred on a less immediately lethal class of compounds. But it represents an early stage of a dynamic that the fentanyl crisis has shown in its most extreme form. A chemical space that can be explored computationally, exploited commercially, and populated with compounds of unknown toxicity faster than public health systems can characterize and respond to them. The fentanyl analogues that have been driving overdose deaths since the mid-2010s emerge from exactly this dynamic, and the lesson of that experience, which is that reactive scheduling after people have died is not an adequate public health strategy, has not yet been fully translated into regulatory reform. The Kratom analog space is a smaller fire in the same building. The question is whether it will be addressed before it joins the larger one. And so here we are, at the end of a very long night in a very complicated grey zone. You have travelled through rainforests and gas stations, through congressional hearings and Reddit threads, through chemistry laboratories and emergency rooms, and the back shelves of convenience stores that never quite figured out what they were stocking. You have met the researchers who cannot get funding, the patients who cannot get answers, the vendors who are trying to do the right thing in a market that does not reward it, and the regulators who keep arriving just after the molecule has already moved on. You have spent the night in the space between the leaf and the law, and if it felt uncomfortable, that is because it is. It is supposed to be. That discomfort is the honest feeling of a problem that does not have a clean resolution, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Check the label. It probably says not for human consumption. What stays with you past the chemistry and the legislation and the policy debates is something simpler. There are people in chronic pain who found something that helped when nothing else did, and are navigating a system that has not decided what to make of them. There are people who developed dependence on something they thought was harmless, because the market they trusted was not equipped to tell them otherwise. There are families who lost someone and do not have a clear answer about why, because the toxicology report is genuinely ambiguous, and the regulatory response has not produced certainty where the science could not. All of these people are real. All of them are somewhere in the story you just heard. None of them are well served by a policy debate that moves faster than the evidence and slower than the chemistry. The Kratom Analogue War is not a story about a dangerous drug. It is not a story about a safe supplement. It is a story about what happens when a society's tools for thinking about risk, legal, medical, political, are not calibrated finely enough for the thing they are trying to measure. It is a story about the cost of that miscalibration, paid in confusion and in harm and in missed opportunities to do better by people who deserved a more careful system than the one they got. And somewhere, a tree is growing in a wet valley in Indonesia, completely unaware of the Federal Register, utterly indifferent to the DEA scheduling calendar, producing the same alkaloids it has produced for thousands of years, in the same proportions, under the same tropical sun. It is not trying to be a crisis. It is not trying to be a cure. It is a tree. The crisis and the cure are ours, our making, our responsibility, our ongoing, unfinished argument about what we owe each other when the line between medicine and danger is a matter of dose, context, and the specific human being holding the cup. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet, let the weight of that complexity go. You do not have to solve it right now. Nobody is solving it right now. The researchers are still gathering data. The legislators are still drafting amendments. The forum users are still comparing notes at 2 a.m, in the specific way that people do when the institutions that were supposed to help them have not quite managed it yet. The argument will continue tomorrow, and the day after, and probably for years beyond that, because the questions at its centre, what is a drug, what is a medicine, who gets to decide and who pays when the decision is wrong, are not questions with final answers. They are questions that each generation has to answer again, with new substances and new evidence, and if we are lucky, slightly better tools than the ones that came before. For now, though, the night is quiet. The chemistry can wait. The policy debates can wait. The grey zone will still be grey in the morning, and that is all right, because grey is not the same as hopeless. Grey is where the careful work happens, where the nuance lives, where the people willing to sit with complexity instead of reaching for the nearest convenient category do the slow and unglamorous work of actually making things better. That work is being done, not fast enough, not loudly enough, and not by anyone who is going to get a press conference about it. But it is being done. Rest now. The leaf will still be in the rainforest when you wake up. The argument will still be waiting. And somewhere out there, someone is reading a forum post at 2 a.m. and learning something that might keep them safe tomorrow, because the system that was supposed to do that job has not gotten there yet, but the humans filling the gap have not given up. That is not a perfect ending. But in this particular story, it is an honest one, and honest. Tonight is enough. Sleep well.